So, namaste everyone. Welcome to the ninth session of Bodha. In this session, we are joined by two great authors and scholars, Dr. Kundan Singh ji and Dr. Shri Krishna Maheshwari ji of Hindupedia. They are the authors of the recent book Colonial Discourse and the Suffering of Indian American Children, which actually does the commendable job of tracing the history of Hindu misia or Hinduphobia back to its original source, which is the British historian and the author of History of British India, who is James Mill. So, welcome both of you. We also have Raghavji, our founder, with us. So before we jump into the Q&A and A and start the exchange, I would like each of them to briefly outline the book and its contents and the idea behind the book, how it came about. So I would like to begin with Dr. Kundanji. Dr. Kundanji, your thoughts and the basis of this book, please.
Thank you, Anshumanji. So, there's a bit of history to this book. And before we wrote this book, we actually wrote this one. This is called Making Children Hinduphobic. The focus of this book was completely different, because we wanted to raise awareness amongst the parents of Indian American children with respect to the problems that you have in textbook discourse. And this was written at the time when we were fighting the textbook battle in California. Both Krishna and I were involved in this. Earlier, we were working on this project separately. And then very quickly we realized that we see the issues quite similarly and our strategies are very similar. And that is why we collaborated. And through that collaboration, this book came out. So there are a couple of things that we did in this book. One was to expose the colonial as well as the Orientalist representation that we found in the book. But while we were writing the book, and given that we did not want to make the book very dense, we would only mention that the themes or the tropes that you had in the book, uh, were colonialist and Orientalist in orientation. And then, from a semi academic perspective, we would refute the claims. But once this book was over, we realized that we needed to go to academia because ultimately it is the academics, it is the professors who write the books. And in most circumstances, these people are not coming from a negative place, they are coming from a place of ignorance. So it was important for us to really expose what was going on and how they were actually regurgitating a colonial discourse in sanitized and politically correct form. The way I look at it is that there are two paradigms that are operational in the representation of India in Hinduism. I call them as paradigms of arrogance and ignorance. Paradigm of arrogance is when there is a deliberate attempt, there's a mischief involved in order to represent the other in a negative way. The missionaries can be faulted for that. But when you come to a writer like James Mill, what we have showed is that he was coming from a place of ignorance. And once you come from a place of ignorance, what is it that you do? You project. You don't look at facts as facts, but you basically project your own psychological and sociological issues onto the other. This is basically what happens. This is something which is very psychological, and this is something which has been discussed in our Vedantic tradition also quite extensively under Adhyatma. So, projection is something which humans are prone to be doing if they are operating from a place of ignorance. So, what we have done in this book is that we have showed how this discourse not only is deeply problematic, but also is based in deep projections and ignorance. And the discourse of James Mill, which was put in place in the 19th century, is still going on. It is getting reflected in the textbooks of children. His reflections are there at all levels of education. You know, we could only sort of focus on the textbook of the children, but if we go into analyzing the textbooks that are used for college children or even for uh, you know graduate adults, we will find a very similar kind of problem, and the problems are there. So what I would say is that this is just the beginning of the journey, and as we go further, we are going to unfold this more and more. But with that, I want to come to my partner in crime, Krishna, to to unfold this further.
Yeah. So we met by happenstance in Sacramento. Kundanji was the only professor from the Hindu group's side who came to give a deposition, and he had no business being there, but he came anyway. Every other professor was on the other side, and they were paid to be there. So they came because it was their job to be there, to keep the books or prevent the books from changing in a way that benefited children. And so that's how we met, and we talked, I don't know, for a year and a half before he joined um, to collaborate on these two books. And he played a fairly instrumental role um, in the California process, and one that's hidden behind the scenes. The process itself in California is broken into two parts. The first part, they developed something called a framework, which you can think of as an entire chapter or two chapters in a meta definition that textbook publishers then use to create their textbook materials. And the prevalence of caste was something around 80% of the content. And he wrote a pretty damning letter, which then other Hindu community groups used in backroom meetings to rescue the process, which we had largely failed at. And we're able to extend the process by a number of hearings. And through that process, the prevalence of caste in that narrative reduced down to about 40%. Not a victory, but a substantial benefit. And then he had to go to India for family reasons. And it was during that period that we got to know each other. And then while we kept talking, I and the Hindupedia team had learned how the process worked. And we started getting actively involved rather than just participating. The following in the second part. In the second part, they had 7+ textbooks that were evaluated. And the interesting thing about that process is, while we all asked for corrections over and over again, they kept pointing to the experts who they used, who were not in the room, by the way. So they were unreachable, unapproachable, anonymous experts. If you could dig, you could find them, but again, you couldn't impact what they wanted to say. We engaged through the whole process. We put all of the technical reviews together of all of the textbooks that were used across all of the different groups that were participating. Well, ultimately, a threat of a process lawsuit and a seed of a relationship that we had built with one of the board members resulted in the banning of Houghton Mifflin Harcourt's K through 12 instructional materials around social studies, which caused an immediate 14% drop in their stock price and eventually led to them going private as the revenue hit was realized over the following 3 years. This is the first time a children's instructional material publisher took a financial hit because of their treatment of Hindu Dharma. But all the other publishers, which still had horrific content, got through. And so that's where we were left. By then, Kundanji came back to the US. We started working on the first book that he pointed out, Making Children Hinduphobic. That started as a letter that was sent to all 1,100 plus school districts in California. It motivated some of them it reinforced some of their decisions, is the best way to put it. Do not move forward with McGraw-Hill, which was the strongest contender left standing. And then has since then been used by activists from around the country to try to get some change in their textbooks. And so I've talked to a number of them over the course of the year since this book has been published, and they've been able to use it to varying degrees of success. But coming back to the experts, and Kundanji mentioned it, and I'm going to reinforce it. They're the ones you can't engage with, but they're the ones that drive everything. And so we had to change their perspective. And while they live in the paradigm of ignorance, what it allows everyone to do is use these racist tropes, these Orientalist tropes, and not feel racist and not feel dirty about it. They're just pointing to the experts. And when you think about the experts, they're basing their opinions on materials that they have access to. And they go back one generation. They don't know where it started, and they don't care to look. And the community is left fighting what they say. This is what we did as well. We fought what was being said in front of us. And what we collectively didn't do, and we couldn't do, given where we were at the time, is look at why is this the way it is. And what we talk about in this book is what I refer to as 6 generations old scholarship. Because we talk about James Mill, he's the fountainhead of the narrative on India and Hinduism. He came out with the materials in 1817. Subsequent scholars picked it up. They were trained on it. Scholars after that read about it from the scholars that preceded them, generation by generation. So no one knows that this is where it started. If you're going to question something as an academic, you check back one generation. You don't check back 6. Right? And so this, I think, is the thing that's unique. The other thing I will mention is this is a work that went through peer review and is now a part of the academic record. And the way peer reviews work is they're blind. The publisher does them. We don't find out who did it. And if they okay it, then it comes out. And that differentiates this work from many others because we're standing within the walls of academia, within that walled garden, and are able to now say this is a part of the academic record that others have to respond to if they want to engage on this topic or anything related to it.
See, the anecdote that you mentioned about going back 6 generations to uncover the sources, I was reminded of SRG mentioning it in his book. And when he was researching this Hinduphobia, SRG is Shri Sitaram Gol. So he also said that these eminent historians, to use the term of Arun Shori, they just create a loop of self-referencing and attributing it to some anonymous ancient source which doesn't exist in actual history. It's only when you go deep, wade within the mud, and start uncovering, then you know that it's all a mirage. It wasn't actually present there. On that point, and while reading the book, this sense came. The You have mentioned the reason why you chose the francophone thinkers lens and box to understand this work of James Mill and not the anglophone thinkers, and you have used a very specific term of epistemic violence, which you have defined as where the colonizer attributes everything evil to the colonized and everything good and everything that is civilized to himself. And thus he starts the narrative and perpetuates it. And we see that today also that narrative is continuing due to that, even post the physical colonization's withdrawal. So I want to understand it more clearly and for the benefit of our listeners as well. Kundanji, what is that epistemic violence, how it acts, and how it has acted throughout the globe, and how to reverse it in your.
Yeah. So interestingly, epistemic violence comes from Gayatri Spivak, who's not a francophone post-colonial thinker. She is an anglophone post-colonial thinker. Um, in the first chapter itself, we give a basic framework of post-colonialism, and in the first chap in the first chapter, uh, while we explain why we are going to use francophone post-colonial thinkers, it's an overview of post-colonial studies which is given. Now, from that perspective, epistemic violence is about epistemological violence which is done to the colonized. Epistemology is theory of knowledge, right? So, we all know that the colonizers created a certain kind of discourse on the colonized. And while they were creating this discourse, they misrepresented the colonized in various ways, in different ways, through the construction of knowledge, through the construction of knowledge on the other. And because it represents the colonized in significant and fundamental ways and distorts the worldview of the colonized in massive ways, that it is considered that a violence has been done to them. And this violence, as we all know from our experience, is very, very subtle. Why is it subtle? You know, even as we speak, if you go to Indian universities, do you think that you will be able to find uh, a framework of social science analysis coming from, let's say, Vedanta, Buddhism, Jainism, and so on and so, Tantra? No, you won't. The framework itself is Western, right? And within that framework, you have this colonial construction of knowledge which is embedded. This is the violence that we are talking about. And the violence has many layers. At times, the violence is subtle, and at other times, the violence is absolutely explicit, as we have pointed out in this particular book. You know, the violence on children because of misrepresentation is extremely explicit. The children are facing it. As soon as they start studying the text, they begin to feel it. And that is the reason they went to Sacramento to depose against the text, while talking about the various consequences that these texts were having on them psychologically and sociologically. So here, the violence is absolutely explicit. But when you do not have the framework or the epistemological approaches of our ancestors going back to millennia as part of our educational system, that is subtle violence. And that violence reverberates throughout the civilization, throughout the culture. There are many different shades. It is sort of represented on a spectrum.
And just to add one more thing to it, there is a direct violence, which Kundanji is talking about. There's also an indirect violence. Because while the violence is epistemological, it is not just trained or taught to students who are Hindu in nature and receiving the violence. It's also trained to people who follow the Western epistemology. And those kids and those people then see us, see Indians, through that lens that they've received. And because they've been trained on that lens, they now treat us in a specific way. And that way is not something we detailed in this work, but that violence exists. And not only does it exist in the classroom through things like bullying, but it also exists in every other facet of life. And we become so accustomed to it that we become apathetic to it, explicitly and outwardly, while that continues to hurt us internally. So there's a direct portion and an indirect violence here that is committed.
And this is, from a India perspective, this is pervasive in India as well. Of course, because the academic frameworks are drawn from what the Western theorists have given. But like Sai Deepak ji asks in his book, how do you recognize the value of something, the loss of which you are not aware of? So there is actually a twofold process even in India, that you have to recognize that there was something of value. Then we have to recognize the process through which that was lost. And amidst all this, you have an entire global culture that is telling you that civilization is Bitcoin, civilization is interstellar. I'm just grateful from a from Indian perspective as well, that there is somebody who's talking about children and the experiences that our children have going into global spaces. What does globalization mean if a Hindu cannot be a Hindu in those spaces? So it's not just when we look at this as the Indian American children, a lot of Indians travel to US to study, and to that it's actually a universal Hindu concern, and that's the way I looked at it when I read your book, Dr. Singh and Krishna.
Yeah, no, I think you're spot on. But I'll add one thing. If you look in the context of India, because India itself is the receiver of the violence and has internalized the colonial knowledge systems,
Yeah,
our scholars now build on top of it.
yeah.
And so in turn, we commit the epistemological
Ourselves.
violence on ourselves. And then we wonder, why is that that's happening? Because again, I talked about generations of scholarship. They're trying to correct one level. They're not going to the root of the problem. And with all deference to Sai Deepakji, we believe in the inverse. If you do not deconstruct what you have, you cannot recognize and reconstruct what you lost.
Hmm.
Because you just can't recognize it. So
That's
this
the
work
question
is
he's
the first
asking as
work.
well.
Yeah, and to add to this, when you will go into our systems of thought, you will find that epistemology, theory of knowledge, is extensively discussed, in all these traditions, in in all these various ways of looking at reality. The question is, where are they?
Hmm.
Where are they? And you know, one of the reasons is what this book exposes. James Mill and colonizers like him basically operated on this fundamental dichotomy between
Yeah.
savage and civilized, right? And as Anshumanji pointed out, uh, civilized and all the various descriptions of civilized and civilization was appropriated by the colonizer, and all the definitions of savagery were conflated with the
Colonized.
colonized. Now, the colonized, we should not have shame in saying that. We have internalized that. And the internalization is so deep and unconscious that we do not even think that there is a valid epistemology in our traditions. There's a valid epistemology, you know, of knowledge pursuit, which must be taken into account seriously. And just to piggyback on what Krishna mentioned, Our approach revolves around deconstruction and reconstruction. And in fact, Bhagavji, before we come to reconstruction, in our intellectual journey, we are going to deconstruct and deconstruct and deconstruct absolutely so that all the falsehoods are completely exposed. You know. Once the falsehoods are exposed, then only truth will get considered. So, this book, by the grace of the divine, is the second in series. There are going to be many more. And the focus is going to be on deconstruction and deconstruction. Of course, there are so many people who are involved in reconstruction, they can take help of this book and really look at the falsehoods, that have been generated on our civilization and the root of the falsehood,
Yeah.
you know.
It's actually a travesty that currently all of the entire world follows this episteme of the colonizer, this singular way of generating knowledge. And of course, the narrative itself is mainstream. If you consider the case of Hindus, it's the same narrative which is present in US, perhaps to a greater degree, which would be present in Mexico. There also, in the rest of the world, also I assume that it would be caste, curries, and cow. That would be the generic template that is fixed on this. I remember I shared while I was going through your book, I shared a screenshot with Raghavji. It was actually a anecdote by James Mill. He was writing about ki means somebody had accused him that you have not visited India yet you are writing about it. So he writes that if I had visited India, my lenses might have been prejudiced. Now I'm receiving knowledge from census and data, and I'm actually curating it, and I'm seeing the bigger picture. But we see that it was not so. He completely unloaded his biases into this, as you have rightly pointed out in the book. The entire thinking derived from Scottish Enlightenment and the systems prevalent then in Britain. He unloaded all of it and projected it onto us to show us as oppressive and everything, all the bad things. So I was discussing with Raghavji that point about how we in our knowledge systems had the concept of darshana, and there was a beautiful story. I don't know if you have come across it recently, but it was about a disciple seeking a guru, and the guru sending the disciple again and again, saying, "Go have darshana and then come. Go have darshana and then come." And after multiple years such uh, going out and having darshana, the disciple automatically becomes enlightened. So without darshana, there is, while we may impute to ourselves the sense of rationality, as we saw in the case of James Mill, without having darshana, it's futile. And this is the theory also that you build about Indian cosmology and how it is different from the Western derived cosmology, which divides the world into dichotomy: savage, civilized, light, dark, good, evil,
Yeah.
and we look at it from a unitary approach. Would you like to expound more on that, the Indian cosmology part that you have mentioned in book?
Yeah, thank you for pointing that out. See, I have developed, these theorems on binaries, and I've looked at how Western cosmology has operated from the times of Greeks, and the entire study has been encapsulated in theorems, and if I am permitted to use our own terminology, they are basically sutras. You know, we have traditionally believed in sutras. What are sutras? It's basically distilled knowledge. So, you know, thousands of pages have basically been distilled in these theorems, and these theorems, have been uh, put through peer review. They are part of the academic canon. So, what is the fundamental difference? When you look at all our darshanic traditions, you will find that there is a lot of discussion on dichotomies and binaries, and not complex dichotomies and binaries. They begin with very simple dichotomies and binaries, like true and false, right and wrong. So the way our mind is structured, we think true is true, false is false. These traditions, they give you the first jolt, and they tell you that you won't be able to conceptualize one without the other. Not possible. If false is taken away, true also goes away. So, in order for true to exist, false also needs to be there. They are co-determinants. They are mutually defining each other. They are embedded in one another. And to cut the long story short, it basically says to you that as long as you're operating in binaries and dualities and dichotomies, you will remain focused, or you'll remain embedded in avidya, loosely translated as ignorance. Avidya within our tradition also means the knowledge of the phenomenal world, not the transcendental world. So that's where you will remain focused. And then one of our thinkers, Nagarjuna, he gave the philosophy of Chatuskoti, where he says that mind can take one or more of the following positions when A is a truth contention. A is true, A is false, A is both true and false, A is neither true nor not false. These are the four positions that mind can take, and as long as you're operating in one or more of these four positions, you are floating in ignorance and you will not attain pragya. How do you attain pragya? Unitary, will not be the right way to describe it. Pragya begins to occur, and it is a process also spread out on a spectrum when there is a complete collapse of binaries. You know, in epistemology, what is the fundamental binary? The fundamental binary is between subject and object, right? Subject and object need to collapse completely. You need to come to a state where there is no subject and no object. You know, you have become one with the pursuit of your knowledge. When you attain that, that is when darshan happens, vision happens. You experience quote unquote spiritual reality, yogic reality. And through those experiences, you know, our darshanas have been written. This is something very distinct from Western cosmology for many reasons. One is that for the longest period of time, you know, it operated in subject object dichotomy. When the paradigm of modernism was operational, then object or objective was privileged over subject or subjective. In fact, subject and subjective were completely suppressed. And because James Mill was operating within the framework of Scottish Enlightenment, he did not feel the need to come to India, you know, because his subject was completely denied. And it was not necessary for him to engage in his subject in order to create knowledge on India. Let's move the story forward. You know, the paradigm of enlightenment was challenged by the paradigm of romanticism. And as the Western story moves further and forward, you have the paradigm of modernism. You know, in modernism also you have, object and objective getting privileged. In fact, in enlightenment, what gets privileged is reason and progress. But they're quite interrelated. Then you have the challenge of postmodernism. What does postmodernism do? Postmodernism flips that binary. Subject, begins to get privileged. Object begins to get undermined. And then after a certain point in time, you know, some sort of a compromise will be reached at, which will be to look at the creation of knowledge through a dialectical interchange or exchange between subject and object. So the Western cosmology remains, you know, limited in this particular way from our perspective, from our epistemology. Now, in order to understand this, in order to understand epistemic violence, it becomes incredibly important to understand both these epistemologies. Then only you will be able to understand what is it that is getting undermined and what epistemology is undermining the epistemology of India. So, Vedanta, Buddhism, Jainism, and many other traditions that we have, they have been given to us for the pursuit of knowledge, and we should look at these, from that perspective, not because it's like we want to get into good mental states, which also comes, but that's not the idea. It is about gaining the knowledge of life.
I have a follow-up question on that, and maybe Krishnaji can also speak about it. Kundanji, this lack of integrality in knowledge, how much of that is derived and predicated on the structure of academia that we've created? So, if knowledge is organized into departments and silos, and then today we talk about interdisciplinarity, multidisciplinarity, transdisciplinarity, is there a case in your experience, and you've seen the American education system up close, that knowledge first, because of the subject object separation, the structures of knowledge that you created also resemble that, and they also replicate that, and therefore the mind itself is not integral. You spoke about the level of consciousness that the Indian rishis had when they looked at everything together. How does the academic structure influence? Does it influence, or is there a way within the present structure that you see a possibility for integrality to emerge?
It can happen in India. I don't think this is going to happen uh, in the Western civilization, and we should not be concerned with it. Also, the Western civilization is going to do its own thing. It has its own place. It has its own value. It is going to follow its own trajectory uh, in the comity of nations. What I feel is that there's something else that needs to be created within the Indian setting. And when you talk about social sciences from an Indic perspective, discussions on epistemology become extremely important. However, before here as well, just like we were talking about deconstruction and reconstruction, you first have to understand Western epistemology thoroughly well in order to represent Indian epistemology properly. See, mind has a very peculiar tendency. It looks at things in opposites. So I'm finding, in India also, that there are a lot of people, who are talking about the Indian civilization and Indian concepts as diametrically opposite to the Western civilization. There's a problem that there. This is not in consonance with our own epistemology. In fact, I would say that our epistemology transcends and integrates Western epistemology. Now, in order to transcend subject and object, right, you need to have subject and object to begin with, right? The Western cosmology is talking about it. It has played with it. It has played with it in many different ways. And then, you have those in the Indian civilization as well. It is not, it's, it's in the Indian darshana systems, they don't get into the transcendence of subject and object right away. You know, there's a pathway, right? You have Vaisheshika, you have Nyaya, right? Vaisheshika is very similar to what can be called as positivism. Nyaya is very similar to what can be called as rationalism. Once you have been sort of trained in these two, that you will be able to get into the traditions of Vedanta, Jainism, Buddhism, Tantra, and so on and so forth. And all these traditions are also using what has been taught to you in Vaisheshika and Nyaya, right? So there is a spectrum, there's a spectrum. There are convergences as well. So this whole discourse that I'm finding in India, which is kind of making things diametrically opposite to the Western world, is a problematic discourse. It does not show, in my understanding, the nuances that are involved.
Krishnaji, did you have any perspective on this?
I have
And also
a
about the
very
disciplines that are involved, because we've looked at
yeah
history only as history, but this entire thing is about the psychology of history, the cosmology. How do you look at this?
yeah I have a very different take on it. I can't even light a candle to Kundanji on how he described it. My perspective is one of implementation, right? What we have is only the objective system taught to us. It's only object. Subject is completely suppressed from preschool through college. It doesn't matter at any level. There's no discussion of subject. And at the post-collegiate doctoral level, maybe you start introducing some of it in some niche fields, right? And some of this is in the field of psychology, limited amounts in other places, but very, very limited. And what you need, given our system and our epistemology, is you need to spoon feed it at every level in the right balances. You have to develop both. You have to develop an understanding of both, all the way from kindergarten and preschool. Only then can you get ready to go above and beyond both after you've reached adulthood. Otherwise, you're simply not equipped. And if you introduce it suddenly and it's too late in life, you throw it out. Can't even imagine a world where subject has any relevance. An apple is an apple, right? No matter how you look at it. We tend to boil arguments down to very simplistic tropes and miss out everything that actually needs to be discussed. And you asked for specific subjects. And the challenge here, most broadly discussed, lies in the field of physics and quantum mechanics, right? And if you've heard of Schrodinger's cat, is the cat alive or dead when it's in a box? And it turns out it's both until you open the box and check, and then it's only one of the two, right? And it's a very simplistic example of the problems that quantum mechanics scientists observe. So the problem isn't only limited to history, but our perspective on every subject area is this way. When do you learn quantum mechanics? Again, you're in college or beyond. You don't discuss these things early, and even if you do, it's a very specific thing in a grade school that you memorize and you move on with your life. It's not something you internalize and apply more broadly. So every field of knowledge has to explore this. And again, it's stage wise. You explore it differently and you mature that understanding over time.
There is another point that I wanted to touch upon, Krishnaji, and I think it makes a lot, especially in the contemporary times, this point is highlighted much more. when we are deconstructing the narrative which has been set forth, and when we are using post-colonial lens to do it, there is, I think, a high chance that we uh, tread upon the path of victimhood, and I think it's much more prevalent and much more visible in United States what the victimhood narrative and the victimhood politics around it has done now and is doing to the country. The entire movement of wokeism and blaming every ill onto the process of colonization, colonizer, downright to, like, there was an amusing example few days back that the sun is affecting Dalits more than it's doing Savarna. It has come down to such nonsensical claims. So, how do you recommend that when we are on this path, when we are doing the deconstruction and reconstruction, we avoid the victimhood narrative completely and we stick to the facts and keep our heads while we are doing it?
Yeah, and when you look at the narrative that you brought up, it's not a deconstruction narrative, right? It took the francophone um, knowledge base, if you will, that set of work, and continued to build on it in a different direction. So it's almost an independent and slightly different path than the one we're on, right? And fundamentally, we have a very rich epistemology. The question is, how do you focus on it and bring it out and get it accepted once again in the knowledge authority spaces that exist today, right? And if you do it without deconstruction, then you're now having to justify it within that colonial framework, which simply cannot be done. And you get outright rejected, or you get relegated to the back room, and it goes nowhere. And even if you look at the education system today, how many people send their kids to a Gurukul, even though they exist and provide the correct Indic epistemological training? No one does. And if they do, everyone comments that kid will never have a career in life. He will never be able to go to college. And you hear all of those diatribes. So as long as we continue down the path of deconstruction and then the path of bringing back, right, reconstructing what once was, we have a solid foundation. That is a foundation that is unmatched anywhere else in the world. So I'm not really worried about taking the path of wokeism and following it. On the other hand, if you don't deconstruct, then what we have received through the colonization process leads yourself naturally down the woke path. I have talked to so many people that have grown up in the US and they're apathetic to communities other than their own. Or sorry, they're apathetic to their own community and focused on the needs of other communities. You can ask them straightforward questions about, are you concerned about X around the Hindu community? And they will flip it around and say, I'm really concerned about Y about this other community. And it's something that's internal. It's not something they think about. But again, because they've been poisoned about their own traditions, they don't think it's something that's worth paying attention to. And I've heard senior acharyas discussing this about their disciples and their disciples' children's. Right? They've known these people their whole life. They've known the children their whole life. And then they wonder what happened. This was such a nice household. They trained their kids so nicely. They went to college. They got married. And then what happened? Suddenly, I don't know this person anymore. Right? They suddenly built some views. They left the community. There's nothing we can do at this point. But this happened because the deconstruction and reconstruction didn't happen in time for them. And all we can do is focus on the future and make sure it happens for the next generation.
I just want to chime in here. If you look at our work, you'll find that we are not writing from the position of victimhood at all. In fact, we are writing from a place of power, inordinate amount of power, where We are saying that, look, your discourse is wrong, and here are the reasons why the discourse is wrong. And in order to expose the falsehood of this discourse, you know, just to use a phrase which Krishna used to use with me, you know, I had to boil the ocean. I literally boiled the ocean, you know, went into almost everything which is, uh, which is written on James Mill and which has been written by James Mill. And James Mill himself was voluminous. So who says that, that we have written this from a position of victimhood? On the contrary, it's a position of extreme power, and we stand in that light, the light of power which comes from spirituality. Now there's another thing. When we start situating this discourse within the framework of wokeism and non-wokeism and so on and so forth, inadvertently what we are doing is that we are once again inviting, you know the foreign categories onto our own situation. you know the battle of wokeism versus right is a problem of the West. Why are we internalizing it? Why this intellectual laziness? Why are we not talking about our own categories? Once again we are doing the same thing. As we speak about decolonization, are we really decolonizing ourselves? It's an important question to ask. And that is why, I have maintained this very clearly, that our discourse is not ensconced in the left right binary, or the right woke binary. We just take clear of it completely. We will create our own categories. These categories will come from our tradition, from our cosmology, and and that's why, in fact, before I started writing chapter 4, I had to develop this Indian post-colonial theory, as you must have seen. And in order to do that, you must have seen, the references. So all those articles had to be written, peer reviewed, and published. And then only I was able to develop this post-colonial theory. But it's a matter of pride for us that we are using our own categories. And this is what I would uh, appeal, to all the thinkers who are operating in Indian cosmology, to create our own categories that are in tune and tandem with our own cosmology, which means that that our own traditions, our darshana systems, will have to be studied properly, you know, very deftly, and time will have to be put in this effort. So this is,
It's a very poignant.
sorry.
And I was saying that's a very poignant and also timely call, because there is a politicization of this discourse, and to a certain degree, it's understandable because there is an anxiety about what we are rediscovering and how we position that. But unless, like you're saying, Krishnaji, Kundanji, we are able to take it beyond the politicization, the question itself that Anshuman asked comes because in the Indian discourse also, there is this anxiety that just because some other traditions, whether it's in Africa or Latin America, have used decolonization and have gone in a different direction, that we might end up there. But that exactly is the problem that you pointed out. That's because you're framing it in those categories. There is no way that with the Indian epistemology, with the darshana system, that you can end up there. And we've got to have that confidence. And I think this book is a testament to that. So it's actually beyond the subject itself. It's actually the rediscovery of the way to inquire new subjects. That's how we look at this.
And Raghavji, if you will really look at it, when you practice within our tradition, there is no anxiety. Anxiety goes away. Even psychologically speaking,
Yes,
it goes
absolutely.
away. Because of the grace of the divine that descends on you.
Yeah,
So there's no anxiety or anxiousness about this. You know,
yeah,
you're 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 fully stable in what you're creating, and you believe that your ancestors who have come before you are actually guiding this process.
Yes. And that's, of course, Sri Aurobindo, and we should have another conversation. And that's actually what is missing, Kundanji. I'd love to have a separate chat with you on this. The Sri Aurobindonian perspective on the spirit that moves history and how civilizations emerge and what this is moving towards. That meta perspective is completely missing, even in, from whatever I could see in the departments that teach history or philosophy or psychology separately. That integral perspective that can develop integral minds. So yeah, hopefully we'll also talk about the pedagogy for that, how to combine both the cognitive, performative, and embodied traditions. Maybe that's coming up as well in your work.
Yeah, I'll just add one sentence very quickly. What we are seeing, in Indian universities dealing with IKS is also a problem of binaries. There's a split which has been created between traditional and modern. And because, the traditional or tradition is being privileged, the modern is getting suppressed, and Sri Aurobindo gets conflated with modern, and that is why people are not paying attention,
Yeah,
to this profound sage.
yeah,
Where is my knowledge coming from? It's coming from him,
yeah.
you know. I mean, both the mother and Sri Aurobindo have been guiding this pursuit, for a very long period of time. In fact, this work itself is tied, unconsciously actually, to the work of Sri Aurobindo.
It is.
Look at the foundations of Indian culture. First three chapters. Is India civilized?
Yeah,
Remember that?
yeah, yeah, yeah.
When I
Sure.
was writing this, was I consciously thinking about it? I was not.
But it
This
is
is
linked, of course.
this is the guy.
Kundanji is a student of Aurobindo, after all. He can't help it.
No, I totally identify with that. I know that Anshuman's got a question and maybe wants some finishing comments from both of you.
Uh, no, actually, I had in mind of asking about Shri Aurobindo itself, and when you said we speak from a position of power, my eyes inadvertently went to the portrait of Shri Ma and Shri Aurobindo behind you. So yes, perhaps we can have it as part of another conversation. How do we envisage a future, a dharmic future? And Sri Aurobindo ji has also written about it, the human society and its ideal. What we seek to achieve through works such as yours, which I believe have laid a very fundamental foundation, very strong foundation for doing the deconstruction and then subsequently the reconstruction. So yes, with that, I would like to take closing comments on it. Just uh, uh, brief thoughts from both of you about how you see this work influencing and when would you consider this work having attained its objective, especially in the Indian and American context, both Krishnaji and perhaps then Kundanji.
Yeah, so you asked two questions there, and the answers are very different for the two of them, right? Because 4 out of 6 chapters are global in nature. They're not limited to just the US. And the last two are very specific to the US and the US conditions for Indians. Now, what from an Indian perspective, we'd like to see people use this work and build upon it. And in fact, we're visiting a lot of universities and making calls for collaboration. So I'll repeat it here as well to all scholars and all academics that are listening to this discussion. Reach out to me and let's figure out how we can collaborate and build upon it. Because that's what we need to do. We need to continue the deconstruction and broaden it. Now, in the US standpoint, I won't go into detail here, but at a high level, what our objective is fundamentally to change the discourse in academia. And that's an end-to-end goal. That's not just about children's instructional materials. Of course, this work will impact and support the work to change children's instructional materials, it directly connects to the first book, Making Children Hinduphobic. And so what it does is provide a fundamental and foundational basis to connect the damage that's being done with the work, with the materials that are taught. Right? It's not about what's right and what's wrong. It's about there is fundamental damage that is being done to kids, and that damage is not acceptable in the US in a broad sense. And so we must change. And we'll use it in that way. So the goalpost there is also change, and it is a permanent change in textbooks, but the broader goal is a permanent change in broader academia.
Also, Kundanji, your final closing comments.
Yeah. So, as I mentioned earlier, this is going to be part of a series. I have some ideas, with respect to making interventions um, in Western academia as well. Though our next book is going to look at something very specific concerning Indian academia. You know, so wait for about say a year or so. You know, we'll we'll come back with that book to you, and we'll give you the details. So there are some pieces of work um, that are in the pipeline. So yes, I mean, we are looking at India and the United States simultaneously, and as Krishna rightly pointed out, the first four chapters of the book uh, can be applied to India and Hinduism studies across the world. It is only the last two chapters that become US specific. So yeah, so there's going to be a lot which is going to emerge, and I think it is through collaborations, through um, joint writings, that we will be able to shift the balance. Our focus is academia and completeness. You know, we are not going to remove our focus from academia. So yeah, so those are my closing thoughts.
So I'll add one last thing, and
Sorry,
this is not a goal, but
yeah,
as a request to everyone that's listening to us, is that the book is published through open access, which means that the digital copy is freely accessible for everyone, everywhere, and doesn't cost any money. And what we'd encourage people who are watching this is to go click on the link and go read it, and then go meet others who have read it, or encourage others to read it, and then discuss. You have to do Chintan, you have to do Mananan, you have to internalize this if you want to get out of this. If you want to decolonize yourself and open yourself up to the possibilities of our own epistemology and all that it brings you, then participate in the deconstruction by doing it for yourself and for your family and for your friends.
Thank you. Thank you for those closing comments. And here, uh, I'll also attach the link for the book with this conversation when we put it up. And hopefully, it gains a wide audience and wide readership. Look forward to your next book, and perhaps we'll have again such a discussion. Maybe we can also collaborate on that. Let us see. But thank you again, Kundanji. Thank you, Krishnaji, for joining us today and having this conversation with us. And we'll meet again, hopefully soon. Namaste. Thank you.
Thank you. Namaste.
Thank you.